Okay, good morning and welcome to the 13th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. Could I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are in silent and that all other notifications are turned off during the meeting. I'll welcome our colleague Lorna Slater MSP to the meeting, who's attending as a substitute for Ariane Burgess MSP, and invite Lorna to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I don't have any relevant interests to this committee's work. Per my register of interest, I used to work for Orbital Marine Power and I am a member of Unite the Union.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Members of the committee, the first item on our agenda this morning is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Thank you for that. Our business this morning is consideration of the Housing Scotland Bill at Stage 2, Day 2. I welcome to the meeting the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and her officials. We are also joined by other members of the Scottish Parliament who have lodged amendments to the bill and are present to debate those with us today. I'll briefly explain the procedure we will be following during today's proceedings for anyone watching. Members should have with them a copy of the bill, the marshalled list and the groupings. These documents are available on the bill webpage on the Scottish Parliament's website for anyone else who is observing. I'll call each amendment individually in the order of the marshalled list. The member who lodged the amendment should either move it or say not moved when it's called. If that member doesn't move it, any other member present may do so. The groupings of amendments set out the amendments in the order in which they will be debated, and there will be one debate on each group of amendments. In each debate, I'll call the member who lodged the first amendment in the group to speak to and move that amendment, and to speak to all the other amendments in the group. I will then call other members with amendments in the group to speak to, but not to move, their amendments, and to speak to other amendments in the group if they wish. I'll then call any other members who wish to speak in the debate. Members wishing to speak should indicate that by catching my eye or catching the clerk's attention, please. I will then call the Cabinet Secretary if she has not already spoken in the debate. Finally, I will call the member who moved the first amendment in the group to wind up and to indicate whether he or she wishes to press the amendment or to withdraw it. If the amendment is pressed, I will put the question on the amendment. If a member wishes to withdraw an amendment after it has been moved and debated, I will ask whether any member present objects. If there is an objection, I will immediately put the question on the amendment. Later amendments in a group are not debated again when they are reached. If they are moved, I will put the question on them straight away. If there is a division, only committee members are entitled to vote, and voting is by a show of hands. It's important that members keep their hands raised clearly until the clerk has recorded their names. And if there is a tie, I must exercise a casting vote. The committee is also required to consider and decide on each section and schedule of the bill and the long title. I'll put the question on each of these provisions at that appropriate point. We will not dispose of any amendments beyond the end of part 1 of the bill today. And so with that, members, we will begin the proceedings. I call amendments 281 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Now, could I remind members of the preemptions in this group as set out in the groupings, including the correction that Amendment 286 preempts Amendment 55 in the group Student Tenancies and Accommodation. So now the Minister to move Amendment 281 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee. The amendments in this group relate to the amount that landlords can increase rent by where a rent control area is in force, and include government amendments in the name of Paul McClellan to set out the form of the rent cap on the face of the bill. The amendments also touch on concerns about the impact of rent controls on the circumstances of individual landlords and where it might be appropriate to allow additional increases above the level of the cap. I recognise these concerns and continue to engage with landlord representative organisations and others in the sector. Section 14 of the bill includes a power for Scottish ministers to make regulations that allow for rents to be increased above the level of the rent cap in specified cases. The aim is to ensure that, where appropriate, the individual circumstances of landlords who might be disproportionately impacted by rent control can be taken into account. Now, I fully agree on the importance of providing clarity to the sector as soon as possible about how this will be accomplished, and I do recognise that some stakeholders would prefer that this detail is set out in primary legislation. However, it is essential that decisions on this are informed by consultation to ensure that the potential impacts of the use of this power are fully understood and that measures are developed in a way that is fair, robust against challenge and can be clearly set out in legislation. I have listened to the calls for clarity from tenants, landlords and investors about the implementation of rent control, and this is why the Scottish Government has recently published a consultation to support consideration of how these regulation-making powers could be used. This will ensure that impacts of any decisions on the use of these powers are fully understood and any measures are framed in a way that is clear and proportionate. Bringing forward this consultation earlier to what might have been anticipated, for example, after the bill had completed its passage through Parliament, allows us to provide the clarity being sought as soon as possible and will support us to bring forward any secondary legislation at the earliest opportunity following royal assent. Now, I want to make very clear I am completely convinced of the need to use powers in the bill to exempt, where appropriate, certain categories of property from rent control and to allow rent increases above the level of the cap in certain circumstances. This is important to ensure that we continue to encourage investment into Scotland and into housing. However, this must be supported by consultation, which ensures that the impact of any such measures is fully understood and our actions do not create any unintended consequences, taking into account the views of everyone with an interest. Certainly.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for giving way. We've known for quite some time that the Government was considering rent controls and looking to bring in rent controls to the sector. So can I ask why the consultation wasn't carried out prior to this stage of the bill? And will the Cabinet Secretary reassure the sector today that the consultation will not go on as long as it has to and exemptions will be made clear as soon as possible?
Well, I'll give the absolute assurance that the consultation is due to close soon, and we anticipate this to be one of the absolute priorities of the Government to move forward with the analysis of that consultation and then regulations thereafter. I absolutely reiterate the real importance of moving on this at pace, which is why we brought the consultation forward. And the reason the consultation has happened at this point is to ensure that we provide that clarity as soon as we possibly can. I absolutely accept that that is integral to encouraging investment within housing. Certainly.
Thank you very much. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would be able to tell us if we would have that clarity that she talks about before stage 3. I'm not necessarily saying put something in the bill at stage 3, but would we have that clarity at stage 3?
Well, I think in some ways that depends on when stage 3 is. Clearly, I've also heard very understandable calls from the sector for us to move through this bill at pace. Now, we're still in the early stages of stage 2, so you'll forgive me, Mr Simpson, if I don't try and estimate when we might complete the bill, but I'm also mindful of looking at how quickly we can get that done. And the reassurance I would give is, regardless of how we're working with stages 2 and 3, at the same time, we're also working on the analysis as soon as that consultation closes, getting that analysis done and getting the drafting of the regulations done. So we are working, regardless of, in many ways, when the bill finishes, to get that done as soon as possible. If I may continue, Convener, that's why our consultation has asked some specific questions about our possible exemptions for mid-market rent and build-to-rent properties. We've also asked questions about landlords who charge rents below market rates and who make improvements to their property. There are also opportunities for landlords who do not see their circumstances reflected in the specific questions to give their views, and for tenants to give their opinions on how the proposals will impact them. So to that end, Amendment 302 in Paul McClelland's name sets out that the requirement in the bill for the Scottish Ministers to consult before laying regulations specifying properties which may be subject to modified rent cap may be met by consultation carried out before the relevant section comes into force. This will support bringing forward any necessary regulations as soon as possible after the legislation does come into force, as I've just mentioned in my responses to those interventions. Amendment 332 in Paul McClelland's name sets out the form of the rent cap, providing a formula for the rent cap on the face of the bill, the percentage change in the Consumer Prices Index plus 1 percentage point up to a maximum increase of 6%, is an approach that will provide protection for tenants at the highest risk of the most significant rent increases. Setting a ceiling of 6% can help protect renters against large increases in rents at times when inflation spikes. Including a ceiling means that a greater share of the risk of future extreme economic events which cause a spike in inflation will lie with investors or landlords, who are arguably better placed than renters to cope with the impact that such events can have in the short term. However, the cap will also provide clarity for landlords and investors on rent increases in rent control areas. CPI is a comprehensive measure of the trends in goods and prices purchased by consumers in the UK economy, and the costs relating to running a home are included in the index, for example, costs relating to maintaining a dwelling, as well as the items within a dwelling. Linking the rent cap to CPI is therefore a reflection of the cost to landlords of offering a property for rent. Allowing some margin over inflation, such as the 1 percentage point we are proposing, will give investors some assurance that over the long term, any periods where growth is below inflation may be balanced out with periods where rents may grow a little above inflation. Through the work of the Housing Investment Task Force, we have worked directly with investors and developers to understand how we can bring forward a system of rent control that both works for tenants and supports the continued investment in private rented housing. Certainly.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and I think she sets out the rationale in terms of investment and also economic shocks. I just wonder what consideration has been given to the overall economic effect that both the price cap but also the exemptions may have, because there's an overall effect in terms of price setting and in terms of the effect on supply and demand, and without going into a full economic thesis, those go beyond simply investment and economic shocks, but there will be behavioural effects which may have unintended consequences. And I just wonder what consideration has been given to that broader price-setting dynamic that the price cap will create.
Much so I'm tempted to get into an economic thesis actually on a Tuesday morning. I will refrain, but I think this is an important point, because while we talked about the specifics, it is also important to ensure in general we are providing as much certainty as we can to investors, because I recognise that not only the actions of government, but the perceptions are very important, and it's important for the Scottish Government to be encouraging investment into Scotland and to encourage further private investment into housing. That is an important part of tackling the housing emergency. So dealing with those aspects which you mentioned, Mr Johnson, around ensuring that we are taking into account what happens in the wider sector is exceptionally important, and why we're very keen to give as much clarity as possible. Convener, CPI plus 1% is in line with what some stakeholders in the sector have been calling for. Stakeholders, including the Scottish Property Federation and the Association of Rental Living, welcomed the clarity provided by our statement in October last year, confirming that the form of the rent cap that we are proposing through these amendments. And as it is not only the policy intention of rent control to reduce rents, if the total percentage determined under this formula is less than 0%, then the rent cap would be set instead at 0%. As the form of the rent cap will be set out on the face of the bill, there are several consequential or clarifying amendments which are required. Amendments 281 to 301 and Amendments 334 to 353 are necessary now that we are proposing to set out the form of the cap on the face of the bill. This will ensure all relevant sections of the bill interact appropriately with the new provisions we have set out. Amendment 327 would also make a minor technical adjustment to the wording of Section 18. Turning to the other amendments in this group, Amendments 47, 48, 49 and 50 in the name of Ben Macpherson would let landlords in rent control areas who have not increased the rent for their property in the preceding 24 months set the initial rent for a new tenancy at open market rate. Now, I understand the intention behind these amendments, but I'm clear that the circumstances where rent can be raised above the rent cap should be set out in regulations informed by consultation with those affected, as I've mentioned earlier. Amendment 77, in the name of Graham Simpson, would provide that regulations made under the power created by Amendment 48 in the name of Ben Macpherson are subject to the affirmative procedure. Amendments 61, 62, 63, 64 and 78 and 79 in the name of Graham Simpson would create a process where a landlord in a rent control area could increase the initial rent for a tenancy to open market rent where the final rent in the preceding tenancy was more than 10% below open market rent. And Daniel Johnson's amendments 61A, 61B, 63A, 64A, 64B and 64C would amend Graham Simpson's amendment so that the process can only be used by landlords where the previous rent was no less than 10% below open market rent. Again, I understand very clearly the intent behind these amendments is to recognise situations where landlords have not increased rents such that they have fallen behind market levels. However, these amendments would enable some landlords to increase the rent regardless of whether there had been a rent increase in the preceding 12 months. And that would be inconsistent with the aim of limiting rent increases for a property in rent control areas to once per year. I therefore cannot support these amendments, but can confirm that issues around landlords who charge below market rents are included for consideration in the consultation that was published recently. Amendment 65...
And again, I'm very grateful. I wonder if she would recognise that the intent behind these amendments actually goes beyond simply allowing correction for individual landlords, that there's a risk. And I agree with the broad principle of having a consistent approach to the cap, rent cap, in order to provide confidence to the sector. But there's a risk that rather than acting as a ceiling, it could act as a floor. And unless you have an adjustment mechanism, it will essentially incentivise all landlords to increase not up to, but at that level of the cap. And you know, particularly if we assume that the Bank of England achieves its inflation target, that 1% over that would in essence mean that rents would increase by 30% more than inflation unless you provide an adjustment mechanism. Would you acknowledge that there is a risk and there needs to be some consideration to that in terms of actually the dynamics of how the cap would operate?
I do absolutely see where you're coming from on that. I fear I may repeat this quite often this morning, but regardless of whether I thought that was the right or the wrong thing to do, the place for that to happen is not within the bill. The place for that to happen is within the consultation for that exact points to be brought forward and be to discuss to allow us to move forward in regulations. And members may hear me saying that quite a lot under different amendments in a number of groups this morning. But that's exactly why, for those reasons, we have that consultation and the open questions to allow those matters to be brought forward. So if Mr Johnson will forgive me for not being pulled on that particular point, I think that's a matter for the consultation. Convener, Amendments 65, 66, 67 and 68 and 80 in the name of Graham Simpson would allow for rents to be raised above the level of the rent cap where the landlord has incurred significant costs relating to maintenance, repair or regulatory compliance of the property. The rent officer would be tasked with determining what the appropriate rent would be where the costs are deemed to be necessary and significant, but the amendment does not set out what maintenance, repairs or regulatory compliance would be covered or the basis on which this determination should be. Now, again, I very much recognise the concerns from landlords on the potential impact of rent controls in terms of maintenance costs and the ability to invest in improving and sustaining quality properties. It's important that these issues are considered further, and that's why they're covered in the aforementioned consultation. So I cannot support these amendments and would encourage Ben McPherson, Graham Simpson and Daniel Johnson not to press their amendments. If pressed, I would urge members of the committee not to support them for the reasons I have set out. It remains my position that the circumstances where it would be appropriate to allow for rents to increase above the cap should be set out in regulations that are informed by the consultation. But I hope I've managed to offer some reassurance to Mr McPherson, Mr Simpson and Mr Johnson that I very much recognise and acknowledge the issues they're highlighting through these amendments and that we are actively considering how to address them through the consultation. And I would, of course, be happy to engage with the members following the outcome of that consultation. Amendments 147 and 412 in the name of Edward Mountain and Katie Clark would amend the bill to require that the rent cap must be calculated by reference to the quality, state of repair and energy efficiency of a property. I have responded to calls from the sector for greater certainty of how rent controls will be implemented, and I brought forward a suite of amendments to provide a formula on the face of the bill for a fixed rent cap, which, if approved, would render these amendments obsolete. I consider that setting out the rent cap in primary legislation is needed to offer more clarity to tenants and to landlords and to those who invest and develop rented homes. For those reasons, I cannot support the amendments brought forward by the members, and I would urge them not to press 147 and 412. Amendments 207 and 215 in the name of Rachel Hamilton make changes to the definition of rent payable, specifically to exclude utilities. Amendment 207 would make this change for the purposes of the application of the rent cap, which could allow landlords in a rent-controlled area to increase charges for utilities without any regulation. This amendment of the rent cap to a fixed formula would impact on the amendment, making it redundant. Amendment 215 would make this change for the purpose of the provisions in the bill that regulate rent increases in rent-controlled areas, but this would conflict with the existing definition of rent in the 2016 Act. This would lead to different definitions of rent depending on whether a property is or is not in a rent control area, and therefore would cause confusion. Now, I do acknowledge the concerns raised by landlords, particularly in rural areas, about the potential impacts of rent controls where the tenants pay the landlord directly for some utilities or services. As set out above, the bill already includes regulation-making powers which allow for circumstances where landlords could raise rent above the cap. Our current consultation on the use of these powers acknowledges that rural landlords may face higher utility costs and ask for views on ways that these costs could be treated. And I'd be happy to again engage with Rachel Hamilton and other members following the outcome of the consultation. And I hope that will reassure Rachel Hamilton, and I urge her not to press the amendments. The amendments in Paul McClelland's name in this group, number 281 to 301, 327, 332 to 353, 393, 398, 401, 402 and 406, deliver on our commitment to provide clarity on how rent control will be implemented by setting out how rents will be capped in areas where the rent applies. I'm clear that this must be done in a balanced way, recognise the interest of landlords and tenants, and in a way that continues to support investment into private rented housing. This will ensure the system of rent control introduced continues to support the supply of rented housing, recognising the rented sector is a critical and important part of Scotland's overall housing system. Bringing forward these amendments responds directly to calls for more clarity on the impact of areas designated for rent control. Amendments 289A, 290A and 293A in the name of Maggie Chapman would enable a rent control area to be increased in size via regulations that vary the original designation. I consider that where the rent control area is to be increased in size, this should be considered as creating a new rent control area and should be subject to the full process for designating a rent control area. And for that reason, I cannot support these amendments. Amendments 332A to 332H, also in the name of Maggie Chapman, would amend 332 in Paul McClelland's name. 332A would amend the permitted rate as the lower of CPI inflation plus 1 percentage point or annual percentage changes or expected changes in income. 332B provides that an alternative lower percentage could be set by Scottish ministers in specified circumstances under new powers confirmed by Amendment 332H. And Amendment 332F provides a definition of specified circumstances. Amendment 410 would provide for the new power inserted by Amendment 332A to be subject to the affirmative procedure. Amendment 332C sets out the definition of the terms used in 332A. Amendments 332D and 332E would amend the definition of the latest index in Amendment 332 so as to provide that it would cover the latest index or figure published before the tenancy starts or the rent increase notice is served. For the reasons the Minister for Housing already set out in the Government's response to the Committee Stage 1 report, we recognise that there are benefits in ensuring that increases in rent control areas are linked to increases in household incomes. However, wages are only one component of household income, which may also be affected by hours worked and by other sources of income, such as self-employment, benefits and assets. In addition, average wage inflation may not reflect the differing trends experienced specifically by tenants across the workforce. The cost to landlords of offering a property for rent are also a crucial consideration, and measures of wage growth are unlikely to fully reflect these costs. It is also vital that the rent cap can be clearly communicated. CPI is a well-known metric, and adding in various measures of wage growth in addition to CPI would complicate the rent cap formula while not being directly connected to changes in household incomes. I therefore consider the Consumer Price Index as the most appropriate basis for the rent cap. Certainly.
I hear what the Cabinet Secretary is saying about other means of income being available to many households, but will she accept that wages are the primary source of income for the vast majority of renters, and actually that wage inflation, as we know, has clearly not kept pace with CPI?
So I do absolutely appreciate where Maggie Chapman is coming from on this issue, and I thank her for bringing forward the amendments to allow us to have the debate about how we can clearly set out what the rent cap is. Again, I go back to the points I've already made about the importance of having something which does take into account other income, although I appreciate what Ms Chapman says about the likelihood of that for many renters, but also the real important to allow us to have something that is both is understood by renters and by landlords and investors. And it is that insurance that I think we need to be able to provide to all of those interested parties that is very, very important. And that clarity that this can provide is exceptionally important, as well as I do believe that the CPI is the most appropriate method for the reasons that I've set out.
Quickly on that, Cabinet Secretary, has the Scottish Government done any analysis on incomes of renters and what proportion, other than income, other than wages, renters have?
I'm not aware of that analysis being undertaken to the point where I can talk to it today, but I'd be happy to have that discussion with Ms Chapman following on from stage 2. I appreciate this is an area that she's had a concern with for some time, and we'd be happy to carry on those conversations. I would say, just for the avoidance of any doubt, I think it's unlikely that Ms Chapman will change my mind on the government's position on this, because we do believe that clarity is important. But I'm happy to work with her to see if there's some analysis that we can bring forward to have that discussion before stage 3. Convener, amendments 332G and 332H and consequential amendments 410 would allow the rent cap to be set at a negative percentage in certain circumstances, thus reducing the existing rent of a property. The purpose of rent control has been set out as a stabilising rents in areas where they are rising steeply, and the measures are not intended to allow for a reduction in existing rents. I do not consider that providing for an automatic requirement for rent reductions in certain economic circumstances in this way would allow for rent control to operate in a proportionate way. Further amendments in Paul McClelland's name in this group are consequential or clarifying amendments, including amendments 333 to 353, which make required drafting changes to section 19. Amendment 393 would amend section 52 to remove reference to section 3.1 from the list of powers that are subject to the affirmative procedure. This is in consequence of Megan Gallagher's Amendment 107, which would remove section 13 of the bill. Now, we are supporting Amendment 107 as Government Amendment 329, considered with Group 7, will move this power from the bill itself into the Private Housing Tenancy Scotland Act 2016, in consequence of Amendment 332, specifying the rent cap on the face of the 2016 Act. Amendment 398 would amend the schedule of the bill and is a consequence of Amendment 329. Amendments 401 and 402 are both consequential amendments to the schedule of the bill and provide for regulations made under various sections to be subject to affirmative procedure. And finally, the committee will be pleased to know Amendment 406 would amend the schedule and is consequential on Amendments 107 and 329. In summary, Convener, I would urge members to support Paul McClelland's amendments in this group, and I ask Katie Clark, Edward Mountain, Rachel Hamilton, Ben McPherson, Graham Simpson, Daniel Johnson and Maggie Chapman not to press their amendments in this group. And if pressed, I would urge members of the committee not to support any of the members' amendments in this group for the reasons I've given, but I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for doing that. Thank you. Could I now invite Katie Clark to speak to Amendment 412 and all the other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you, Convener. And I will speak to my Amendment 412, which aims to raise the relationship between the condition of a property and the rent which can be charged to enable rent controls to adequately reflect whether a property is in good condition or poor condition, to incentivise improvements, but doing that in a way that ensures the tenant has protection to ensure that there's not unreasonable rent increases. According to 2023 data from the Scottish House Conditions Survey, 45% of all private rented accommodation in Scotland had disrepair. Currently, measures available to tenants to seek redress are limited. Private sector accommodation is also amongst the most energy inefficient in Scotland. We need to encourage improvements to the stock, but to do that in a way that does not ensure that there are unreasonable rent hikes to tenants. My Amendment 412 seeks to provide that rent payable under a private residential tenancy in a rent control area must not be increased by more than an amount calculated under regulations with reference to the quality, state of repair or energy efficiency of the property. I have listened to what the Cabinet Secretary has said. Will consider her amendments very carefully and would not intend to push my amendment to the vote today.
Thank you very much for that, Katie. Could I call Megan Gallagher on behalf of our colleague Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 147 and other amendments in the group?
Thank you very much, Convener. And similar to the amendment submitted by Katie Clark, this amendment aims to allow repair works improvements to energy efficiency, anything relating to energy efficiency to be carried out, and of course the exemption would be calculated based on the level of work required. I think there is a strong argument here in terms of the condition of the property, whether it's in good and bad good or bad condition, and whether that would actually provide that additional layer of protection for tenants as well in relation to the amendments 412 and 147. I'm unsure at this point if Katie Clark will press, but of course we can see that when it comes to the vote, but I think I've just had an indication that she is not going to press. If I can move on to other amendments in the grouping, I am concerned by amendments 284 and 285, given that it would leave, I think, a loophole in terms of the bill, as ministers would no longer have to consult with the relevant local authorities, tenants and landlords in the form of rent control measures being considered for proposed rent control areas, and the level of rent control measure being considered for the proposed rent control area. And again, in 285, when designating a rent control area, ministers would no longer have to include in their report to Parliament the reasons for this or the level of rent control measure to be introduced for that area. I think that removes that additional layer of protection which is vital to this bill should rent controls be put in place. I would also like to put on record, of course, my amendment that's coming up in relation to removing exemptions. This, of course, relates back to the overall principle Scottish Conservative stance that we are opposed to rent controls, so it's going to be a bit odd pushing for that amendment, but then of course in subsequent amendments talking about exemptions. But again, given that's our overall position and stance, it is right that we remove sections in relation to rent controls. But again, recognising that if rent controls are to be put in place, those exemptions are of course very important in terms of the argument that we move forward, and certain areas that we want to see exempt from rent controls. Of course, there is a consultation ongoing, and again, you know, I have pressed the Cabinet Secretary this morning to ensure that that consultation is concluded as soon as possible to provide reassurance to the sector. I think I'll leave my remarks there just now, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Could I call Rachel Hamilton to speak to Amendment 207 and other amendments in the group, please?
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 207 provides much needed clarity on references to rent payable under Part 1 of the Bill and the designation of rent control areas. The amendment introduces a clear definition of rent payable, and this is essential to ensure that rent comparisons between properties are accurate and meaningful, especially in rural areas where utility arrangements differ significantly. Under the 2016 Act, there is no distinction between rent and other charges, but as set out by the Cabinet Secretary, in rural tenancies, rent often includes payments for water, sewerage or electricity, services that are privately supplied due to the lack of mains infrastructure. Because the Act prohibits passing on service charges, landlords often bundle these costs into the rent, and that creates confusion. I do disagree with the Cabinet Secretary because I believe that she misses the point, because failure to separate out these charges for privately supplied services will undermine the accuracy of rental data and the fairness of rent assessments. She did say that future regulation-making processes would make my amendments redundant. I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could identify how we could separate and ensure the accuracy of rental data so that there is equity amongst those who receive the type of bundle charges that I'm just describing and those who receive and pay for their services through council tax. And in comparison to urban areas, these services, as I say, are normally paid by the tenant directly through the tax, council tax or their utility bills. Amendment 207 ensures that only the true rent, the payable for the property itself, is counted as rent payable. Charges for essential services in areas without mains access would be identified separately, not hidden within the rent. This change would allow for, as I said, more accurate data across local authorities, fairer comparisons across the rental market, and greater transparency for both tenants and landlords. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Maggie Chapman, please, to speak to Amendment 289A and other amendments in the group, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and officials. In many ways, this section, this grouping is the most important part of the bill. If passed, the provisions in this part will allow the introduction of rent controls for the first time in Scotland for almost 40 years. And they could not have come a moment too soon. Since 2010, rents for a two-bedroom property have increased by 61% across Scotland, as an average, but 82% in Glasgow and a staggering 104% in Lothian. Has the quality of properties soared to match these rent increases? No. Have people's wages here in Lothian gone up by 104% since 2010? Certainly not. This is a sign of a fundamentally out-of-control private rented sector. My amendments to the Minister's Amendment 332 change the formula the Scottish Government has proposed, which would cap rents at CPI plus 1% up to a maximum of 6%. My alternative is to cap rents at the lowest of CPI or earnings growth up to the same maximum of 6%. This is an important principle. I've asked SPICE to model both of these formulae. The green version makes a small but significant difference to rents in most areas, though a bigger difference in others. In Glasgow, had it been applied since 2019, rents would be £19 a month lower than had the Scottish Government's formula been in place. And in Aberdeen and the Shire, £66 lower. But for many renters struggling with low incomes and the rising cost of living, this will represent a big and significant help. More importantly, though, these amendments establish an absolutely critical principle that rents should match people's ability to pay. If the earnings and living standards of renters are not increasing, neither should those of landlords. And I do think it's interesting that there hasn't been analysis undertaken to justify the principle that the Cabinet Secretary set out about other earnings, other income being available beyond wages for renters. We have very little evidence of that, and we know most renters don't have significant other income. If landlords' incomes rise more quickly than renters' income, this is nothing more than a pure extraction of wealth from those on lower incomes by those with the privilege to own properties. Raising rents 1% above the cost of living is simply not acceptable to have that in legislation as a given, regardless of what else is happening in the world. We should not be locking in above inflation increases, which is what the Scottish Government's version does. My amendment 332H adds an extra but important provision. It allows ministers to specify exemptions to the formula to allow lower increases, a freeze or a decrease, if you like. I'll speak to this principle more fully in the next group where I have a similar set of amendments, but I've tabled this to recognise that in some areas of Scotland, rents have gone up by as much as 100% in the last 15 years, and even a small increase would simply pile misery on top of that. There are very few renters who have seen their incomes go up by anything approaching 100% in 15 years. Yes.
Has the member modelled her proposals and with its effect on investment in the sector? Does she have an understanding about what this will do to house construction?
I thank Willie Rennie for that intervention. The modelling that we've done with the support of SPICE has focused on the impact on renters, and their ability to pay, their ability to have an affordable house, a roof over their heads. This housing bill was introduced as part, as I said last week, as part of the collection of policies and strategies to provide a new deal for tenants. That is the purpose of rent controls, to allow tenants to have affordable homes to live in, not to line the pockets of profiteering landlords. Yes.
We're in a housing emergency. I think we all agree that we're in a housing emergency and we need the private sector to bring investment in order to build more homes. So how are we going to tackle the housing emergency if we can have that investment here so we can construct more homes, we can build more homes to try and get people into those homes? And surely there's an argument that if we build more homes, that will naturally reduce rents as well.
We have not seen rents decrease when more homes are built, and I have further amendments later on through the course of this bill on some of the challenges around mid-market rent, around build-to-rent. We have not seen rents go down when lots more homes are available through the kind of building that Megan Gallagher describes. I think. Can I finish the point I was making first? I think what we have seen is homes become unaffordable for a vast number of renters being forced into homelessness, being forced into sofa surfing, being forced into invisible homelessness that isn't always captured by the figures that we have. And there are many, many ways to increase supply of homes. What these measures seek to do is to retain affordability as a key element of that supply. Daniel Johnson.
I'm very grateful to the member for giving me, and I accept the fundamental point that we need to assure that people have an affordable home. But would she acknowledge, on the basis of what you've just said, that housing supply is going down, that we're actually seeing the number of starts and completions fall to the lowest level since the global financial crash, and that this is a dynamic situation that absolutely we must seek to ensure that rent is affordable for people. But there is also an impact on the incentive to invest across all sectors, and not just private landlords, but also housing associations and others, and that this is a dynamic situation. But fundamentally, the housing emergency is caused because we have a decreasing number of homes being built.
We've also, over the same time period that Daniel Johnson refers to, we've also seen an increase in the number of people struggling to afford to pay rent. We've seen a significant issue in the increase in unaffordability of homes, in unaffordability of renters, of people not being able to secure tenancies. Never mind get into any other kind of tenure across the housing market. The housing market itself is fundamentally broken. I think many of us believe that, and these are measures that are designed to protect those who are, in many ways, not always, but in many cases, the most vulnerable. Renters who can't afford or who choose not to buy, to be owner-occupiers, but people who have been faced with, as the modelling has shown, over 100% increase in the last 15 years. Very few people, and I would probably say that virtually no renter has seen their income increase by anything like that amount. That's what these amendments seek to do. The amendments Amendment 332H is to try and ensure that a freeze or a cut can be possible, to ensure that because of the soaring rents that have happened in certain areas can be taken into account. My changes to Amendment 289 address changes to rent control areas themselves. 289 allows these to be revoked or decreased. However, it may be the experience of a rent control area that shows that the area itself is too small, and so I've added the option to increase the size of the area. I accept the point from the Cabinet Secretary that this would imply a new rent control area, and I understand that there is hesitation to increase something that hasn't gone through the process of analysis that leads to the designation of a rent control area. But in the analysis of existing rent control areas, there will be that information forthcoming, and I think that could be used to justify increasing an area. It doesn't mean it has to, but it could be used to justify increasing the size of the area. I'd like to speak briefly, if I may, to some of the other amendments in this group. Amendment 412 from Katie Clark and Edward Mountains 147 both allow quality, energy efficiency and state of repairs of the property to be taken into account when controlling rent. Greens have amendments with the same intent in other parts of the bill, and I think these work to support those. So I'm happy to work with Katie Clark and Edward Mountain on these and would support them if pressed, because we do need an effective and consistent approach to drive up the quality of private rented accommodation. A number of amendments seek to allow rents to be increased where they have not been increased recently or significantly below open market rent. These are amendments 49 and 61 and 64 from Graham Simpson. I do have a little bit of concern about these, that not only about complexity, but uncertainty for tenants and renters. Open market rents are already inflated because of the way that they are worked out. So using this as a reference point at the moment is perhaps flawed, but I'll be interested to hear what Graham Simpson says when he speaks shortly. Amendments 66 and 67 allow rents to be increased to recoup costs related to maintenance, improvement or regulatory compliance of a rented property. This, for me, has the potential to send out the wrong message to landlords, specifically in the case of regulatory compliance. We should not be rewarding landlords just for getting their rental properties up to a minimum legal standard by allowing them to raise rents higher. So I'd ask Graham Simpson if he could address particularly the point about compliance. We shouldn't be rewarding people just for meeting basic compliance. Finally, on Rachel Hamilton's amendment 207, I think, I listen carefully to what she was saying about the need to ensure that we are clear what we mean by rents and what utilities may or may not be included in that. And I think her amendment helps us provide clarity in that regard, and we will be supporting that. I'll leave my comments there, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Could I invite Ben McPherson to speak to Amendment 47 and other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. Just checking committee can hear me okay?
Yep.
Thank you. Sorry, we just had some technical difficulties this morning. I'm grateful, Convener, and grateful for colleagues for the opportunity to speak to my amendments today. First of all, I'm sorry I'm not with you in the room and joining remotely. I have a committee visit as part of my other responsibilities with the committee I convene that I wish to honour this morning, which is why I'm joining remotely. In speaking to Amendments 47, 48, 49 and 50 in my name, first of all, I wish to express my support for this bill and the measures to moderate rent levels generally. And I pay tribute to Living Rent and other campaigners, including those in my constituency, who've helped take us to this point. I've worked collaboratively with them since 2016 because, unfortunately, the amount of people who are paying too much rent too often in my constituency and others is increasingly a growing concern. This includes often large increases between tenancies, which is why I support that measure in this bill. The market hasn't worked on its own, and intervention through regulation is clearly required. Too many landlords are charging too many tenants too much each month, and for the benefit of all of society, I believe that needs to change. That being said, I think it's also really important to emphasise that there are, of course, lots of really well-motivated, generous landlords, and landlords who, in my experience, generally care about their tenants' well-being and want to do the right thing. And I'm grateful for the representations I've received from landlords as well as tenants, and my amendments relate to both parties. In my work as a constituency MSP, I've come across several circumstances where landlords have been charging tenants lower rental levels than they could, because some landlords choose to charge less for a variety of reasons, often benevolent reasons. It might be a vulnerable tenant. It might be a tenant that they've known for some time and they know is a good tenant. And we don't want the bill to disincentivise that sort of benevolent behaviour from landlords and generosity. And when this bill was proposed, one area of concern I heard from the Scottish Landlords Association and others was that rent controls could lead to landlords with these so-called under-rented properties where they charge less than they could, that landlords in that circumstance, because of the measures to make sure that there are rent controls between tenancies, they might feel it necessary to start raising their rents every year so that when a current tenancy ends, they would not be disadvantaged by the restrictions in the bill to control rises between tenancies. Restrictions which, as I've said, I agree with in general. Therefore, Amendment 49 was set down by myself to seek to exempt properties from controls of rises between tenancies so that the benevolent, often smaller landlords who have those under-rented properties aren't disincentivised from offering those lower rents to, for example, the vulnerable or reliable tenants. However, and the Cabinet Secretary spoke of this in her remarks, I note that from the 23rd of April, running until the 18th of July, the Scottish Government has begun consulting on exemptions. And therefore, I think it would be better and wiser to await the conclusion of that consultation before legislating on such an exemption that I'm proposing. And I would welcome any further reassurance from the Cabinet Secretary that the concept in my amendments will be considered by the Scottish Government as it moves forward to consider exemptions. Since I submitted my amendments, I've also reflected on the definition of open market in Amendment 48 and that this could be excessively costly for tenants. After engaging with Living Rent, I am just mindful that this definition could make tenants vulnerable to having to pay inflated rent costs in constituencies like mine. And therefore, for all of these reasons, I intend to withdraw my amendments but continue to urge the Scottish Government as part of its consultation and the committee as part of its consideration of exemptions in due course to consider the matters I've raised as the implementation of this bill progresses, if it is indeed passed by Parliament at stage 3, which I hope it will be. So I intend to withdraw my amendments, Convener.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that. Can I now invite Graham Simpson, please, to speak to Amendment 61 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks very much, Convener. And it's good actually to be able to follow on from Ben McPherson, because Ben sets out the issue very clearly of a situation where we have landlords who are charging very, very fair rents, looking after their tenants, and they're often rents that are below market value. Ben has set that out very well, and that is the issue that I'm attempting to address in a number of my own amendments. Convener, there was an interesting survey which the Scottish Association of Landlords carried out, and it discovered that actually most tenants, you might be surprised at this, most tenants in Scotland are already paying rent below market value. 60% of respondents said this was the case. 15% of people who responded to the same survey are estimated to be paying more than 20% below market value. Quite surprising figures. So there is an issue there. So according to Amendment 61, if at the end of a tenancy the rent is more than 10% below the open market value, and no tenants from that tenancy will be named as tenants on the next tenancy, the rent can be increased to the open market value. And the initial rent notice must be issued from the landlord to the tenant, specify the date on which there was last a rent increase, the final rent under the immediately preceding tenancy, that the final rent under this previous tenancy was more than 10% lower than the open market rent, and that the initial rent is more than this, but no more than the open market rent. I hope you can follow my explanation there. Amendments 62 to 64 provide for a system where tenants could go to a rent officer if they think the figures are wrong. Now, I note the Minister and now the Cabinet Secretary are looking at this very issue in the consultation, which is ongoing. So on the basis that there is a consultation ongoing in this issue and the other issue that I'm going to come on to, I'm minded not to press these amendments today, but I really want to be very clear on this, that this is an issue that I expect clarity on ahead of stage 3. And I know the Cabinet Secretary said, well, we can't predict when stage 3 will be. My expectation is it'll probably be after the summer. You know, I'm guessing that, but I think we've got time. So I just at this point want to comment on the, I think, welcome change of tone from the government before I move on to speak about my other amendments. There have been very useful conversations with the Cabinet Secretary since the events of last week. And I think that's positive. So I think moving forward, if parties can work together, that will be very productive. She has written to a number of us. She's written to the committee. Certainly in a letter that I was copied into, she was offering to set up a meeting with the PBSA review group. I would encourage her to do that. I think that having a number of MSPs at that meeting, which I think should be an in-person meeting, and at least half a day, because it will have a lot of issues to cover, would be very welcome as we move forward. So if I can move on to the other amendments in this group. I have Amendment 63 onwards, which deals with the issue already mentioned, where a landlord has spent money on, has had to spend money on a property, often significant sums. So in my amendments, they'll have to submit a detailed application to the relevant local authority, including a breakdown of the costs incurred, evidence of the necessity and reasonableness of the costs and any supporting documentation, the local authority would then review the application and determine the eligibility and extent of the rent increase. Now, the intention of these amendments is not to allow landlords to recoup money doing things to properties that should be standard practice, to address the question rightly raised by Maggie Chapman, because that would be entirely wrong. So I know Maggie had that concern, and were that to be the case, I would share that concern. But I think there are enough protections built into these amendments that would avoid such a scenario. But without going through them all, because we have amendments 66, 67 and 68 as well, that I'm also not intending to press these, given that there is a consultation ongoing into this very issue. So, but again, I do want to see some progress on this because it's an important matter. The other amendments that I have in this group are, I'll describe them as fairly technical, so I don't think I need to spend any more time on them.
Okay.
Convener, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Simpson. Could I now call Daniel Johnson to speak to Amendment 61A and other amendments in the group?
Thank you very much, Convener. I should begin by explaining my amendments are largely in place because Graham Simpson beat me to the punch in submitting his on the application of the rent control in terms of the cap. Look, and I should explain at the beginning. First of all, I very much welcome the government's move because I think clarity and certainty is very important for investment. But you know, in line with some of the debate that has happened so far, the fundamental principle of this is that we are in the middle of a housing emergency. That is one that has, as an effect, seen rents increase well above inflation, well above wage inflation, and that is intolerable. And we must attempt to seek to come up with remedies that are effective. That includes ensuring that we have investment in housing supply. Because fundamental to this is that we are seeing a decrease in housing supply, and that, in my view, is having a direct impact on affordability of housing, both in terms of rent, but also for those that are owner-occupiers. And I take the view that it is important that we have controls to protect people against excessive rent increases. That is fundamentally important, and I don't think anyone can look at what has happened in recent years and think that we can stand by and do nothing. But I also, and again, we've already agreed not to go into economic theses, but there is a point here around the way that price setting and supply and demand work in conjunction with one another. And in particular, when you have an issue with prices increasing because of reduction of supply, price controls quite often have the inverse effect to those that are intended. That price controls by themselves, if not considered in a holistic way, can be inflationary in and of themselves. And this is where my concern here is, while I very much welcome a consistent formula for the application of a rent cap, that for in the particular, Ben Macpherson has set out the case very well, that it could disincentivise landlords acting in a way that is generous, in a way that reflects their tenants' needs and requirements. But actually, if you expand upon that across the marketplace, that you could well end up with a mechanism that doesn't act as a ceiling, it acts as a floor. And that would be actually quite perverse. And in particular, if we end up in a lower inflationary environment, one where inflation is at 2% or lower, 1% over and above that rate would mean that renters would experience inflation well in excess of that, of general inflation. Now, that would be a perverse impact. Therefore, it is really important that there is a mechanism for adjustments to be made if rents have been held below, or indeed other circumstances have changed. Because otherwise, I think you are going to incentivize landlords not just to use the cap as the mechanism by which they increase rents, that you may well see that baked into tenancy agreements at the very beginning and ensure that formula becomes an automatic increase. You may also well, and I very much welcome the amendments from Katie Clark and Edward Manton, disincentivise investment in properties. Because if landlords have no ability to adjust rents whatsoever, if that isn't clear, the landlords would be less willing to do so. So the ability to reflect and alter rent on the basis of changed circumstances, investment, and indeed the rents that have been previously set are important for the particular, but also in the general. That what we are dealing with is actually the fundamental mechanisms by which prices are set. If that's not done in a way that reflects the way that markets operate, the behaviours of landlords and indeed the behaviours of tenants, that actually the effects could be counterproductive. So the reason that I have put forward these amendments is because I do not want to see this act as a floor, that it must act as a ceiling, and therefore there needs to be a mechanism for adjustment. Now, I hear what the Cabinet Secretary has said in terms of wider reflection and consultation. I think that is important. For those reasons, I will not press. But what I do believe is that there needs to be some reflection of this on the face of the bill at stage 3. And even though the precise mechanisms may not be able to be put on the face of it, I think that a broad regulation-making powers with the broad objectives should be set on the face of the bill in order to provide clarity and intent and ensure that such a mechanism is put in place. I think failure to do that could simply mean that while this bill is intended to protect renters, actually could see them facing higher prices. And I think that would be an outcome that none of us would wish to see at all. So with that, I will bring my remarks to a close.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for that. I don't see any other members wishing to contribute, so could I invite the Cabinet Secretary to wind up?
Thank you very much, Convener. If I can try and go through at least the main points that have been raised, and can I thank all members for their discussions, particularly around the government amendments. If I can deal with the aspects that Megan Gallagher raised around some concern around the removal of consultation, this is purely because if the rent cap is included as we intend it to be on the bill, there is therefore no need to consult because it has already been included on the face of the bill. So this is very much a technical amendment. If I can turn to the aspects mentioned by Katie Clark and indeed others, I absolutely appreciate there is a need to tackle disrepair within the private rented sector where that exists. Members will know that there are other groups that we will move on to discuss that also discuss disrepair and the general standard of the private rented sector where that is poor. So I think there are other ways of dealing with the challenge which Katie Clark quite rightly puts forward. So be very happy to continue to discuss this overall issue with the member and indeed the other members, convener, who have raised this today and with me previously in the run-up to stage 3 and indeed with the other groups that are coming forward. On Rachel Hamilton's points, much of what she has discussed today is referenced within the current live consultation, so I very much do recognise where she is coming from on that. And the Minister for Housing has also agreed to engage with SLE over the summer on these aspects as well. So I absolutely do take very seriously the point that she has raised. On the substantive issues which Maggie Chapman has raised around the type of rent cap formula, I think Maggie Chapman and I are in exactly the same place. We want to protect the most vulnerable tenants that are out there. This is one of those areas where I will just fundamentally disagree that you cannot protect the most vulnerable if we're doing so by creating a system which puts off investment and therefore puts off the delivery of more homes. So there is a balance to be struck in what we are doing in this area to protect tenants, but also to ensure that we are encouraging investment and therefore the building of more homes. I hope I can reassure her that the repairing standard compliance wouldn't be included in the circumstances where rent could be increased above the cap as set out in the consultation. Others may have different views on that and appreciate the consultation is ongoing. But I think there is, and I'm sure this will come through in the consultation, a discussion to be had about when improvements are made to meet the minimum standards within a sector, and also landlords who may be heavily investing to include modernisation or different types of work. So I'm sure those nuances will come through in the consultation. With discussions around, again, the formula that's been set out, we will again get back to Maggie Chapman, and I'll be happy to discuss this with her. As I mentioned before, stage 3, but the material I have today that I can discuss in closing is that while CPI and wage growth can fluctuate relative to each other over time, the post-war experience has been that wages tend to grow faster than inflation in the long run. And the 6% cap also protects against situations such as recent cost of living crisis, where there's a spike in inflation causing real wages to fall sharply. And I do go back to the point where this needs to be a clearly understood area. But again, I think at this point today, this will be one of those areas where Ms Chapman and I will continue to disagree. But
briefly, I accept what she says about the post-war consensus, but I think there's a general, and I take on board the exchange that you had with Daniel Johnson about not going into an economic lecture here, but I think it's quite clear that economically the financial crash in 2008 has broken that post-war consensus, and we have seen very, very clearly wages vastly underperform any other measure of inflation, and I think that looks set to be the new consensus. And I think looking back to something that's 80 years old as a justification for not keeping up, not allowing people to pay rents that increase in line with their earnings is problematic. But I accept we will just disagree on that point this morning.
I'm afraid we will, but if I can point to some technical challenges around this as well. Wage growth isn't a direct measure of changes in household income, as I mentioned earlier, but there are other complexities relating to the measures, such as that the data from the annual survey of hours and earnings is only published once a year with a significant lag. And while average weekly earnings data is published on a monthly basis, the headline measure, which includes bonus payments, can be very volatile, and it also not a measure of rates of pay, since it can be affected by changes in the composition of workforces, such as the proportion that work full-time and part-time. So although we disagree, I hope it at least reassures Maggie Chapman that this has been something that has been looked at, and as I say, happy to carry on those discussions ahead of stage 3, although I think it might be one of those areas where we will not be able to persuade each other on that point. If I can move to the points that have been raised by Ben McPherson, Graham Simpson and Daniel Johnson, and indeed others. Again, I think everyone's trying to get to the same place on this, convener. We're trying to help landlords who help tenants, and we are trying to endeavour to provide clarity to the sector. Graham Simpson again challenges for clarity ahead of stage 3. I can't see when stage 3 is going to be, but I can again reassure him that we will expedite work in this area, because for me, when I look at the work that we are doing on this bill, the ability for the government and indeed other parties to be able to provide clarity and certainty to investors is one of the integral responsibilities that I feel as we go through this process. So I will do everything that I can on that issue, and I hear what he says around the PBSA meetings, and we will again work with this. The point with Daniel Johnson about what he wishes to see on stage 3, again, for so I don't repeat myself, convener, we do have that live consultation. If there's more reassurance that Daniel Johnson believes we still need at that point that we get to stage 3, I'm happy to have those discussions with him to see what can be done. I would caveat that again with the fact that I do not want to preempt the consultation, and I don't want to do anything that would get into difficulties of us putting something on the face of the bill that we haven't consulted on. I'll leave it there, convener.
Secretary, can I remind members that if Amendment 281 is agreed, I can't call Amendments 54, debated in the group Student Tenancies and Accommodation, and 412, debated in the group Rent Control Areas, amount of rent cap due to pre-emption. So the question is that Amendment 281 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
No. We'll proceed to a vote on Amendment 281. So there will be a division on 281. Could those in favour of Amendment 281 please show your hands? And those against? And are there any abstentions? And the result of the vote on 281 is 6 votes for and 1 against. So that amendment is carried. Okay. I now call Amendment 147 in the name of Megan Gallagher on behalf of Edward Mountain, already debated with Amendment 281. Megan Gallagher to move or not move?
Move.
Moved. So could we have a show of hands for Amendment 147, please? Those in favour, please show their hands. Sorry. The bigger pardon, the question is that Amendment 147 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
No, I heard a no. So we're not agreed. And there'll be a division. Could those in favour of Amendment 147 show their hands, please? And those against? And any abstentions? On Amendment 147, those for is 4 votes for and 3 votes against. So Amendment 147 is agreed to. At this point, colleagues, I would like to call a short break. The next sections are likely to be fairly lengthy, and to give us an opportunity to tackle those properly, it would be useful to call a 10-minute break just now. So we'll reconvene at 9:59. Okay, thank you, members. Thank you.